This is a production of Cornell University.
Yeah, well, as always, thanks to our live audience for you guys listening or watching on YouTube. Thanks for watching. This is the 11th episode of our Cornell Turf Show this year, more than halfway through our spring series. Today's guest, Dr. Shawn Askew, Virginia Tech, lead scientist. We'll talk about a lot of things with Shawn. We may have some spontaneous rapping on the show. Shawn is an accomplished musician. We may talk or may not see that later on. We'll see. But as always, we'll start the show off with Frank Rossi giving us a little bit of a weather overview and some cool little tidbits from the last week we've seen.
Hey, yeah. Thanks, Carl. Hi, everybody. And thanks again to Shawn for joining us. All of you either watching live or watching a recording or listening on a podcast. If you're getting to watch it, you see this, little baby face here announcing probably the most exciting golf time of the year for a lot of us in the golf business, the Masters. And of course, it continues the routine of family members getting out and working. And this superintendent was bragging on his daughter cutting lasers on the greens in the morning. But I'd have to say by far the thing that it actually choked me up when I saw it was Matsuyama's caddy dropping it in and bowing to the course. So, for guys like us, this doesn't get any better than that. Now, with that, Carl, let me get to the BMP of the week with you. Just to remind everybody, this is a project underway with the New York State Pollution Prevention Institute that's housed at the Rochester Institute of Technology, that gets its funding from the Department of Environmental Conservation. And we have partnered with them to work on adoption and uptake of the BMPs. And there's a website you can go to, sign up, get more information. But today, Carl, we got you and this lovely grin on your face promoting our poster. And so what's the tip of the day?
Yeah, so Frank, a lot of times we talk about protecting water quality and we think about the fertilizer we apply on the golf course, the pesticide applications we make, but really our wash pad areas are a source of point source pollution, we could call it, but a singular source, a place where we might see a lot of times the grass clippings that you wash off of equipment, the oil residues that come off of there, and the pesticide residues, sediment. And a lot of times we see those situated near water bodies. So we have some points on this poster that address things you can do to reduce the amount of water that you use at a wash pad facility, and also maybe to help with water quality. And so some of these things, reducing just the amount of water you use goes a long way. Just changing the hose nozzle, right? And there's this little brass hose nozzle we got here that our friend Rick Slattery, former superintendent of Locust Hill Country Club, found works really well. It's $10. You can pick it up at a hardware store, and it reduces your water use on wash pads by 50%, right? So that's one really easy thing. Switch in, switch out, get a cheap nozzle that can help you reduce the amount of water. And then, another thing you could do is just blow equipment off before you wash it with whether that's a backpack blower, a pressurized air blower. Not only does that significantly, again, reduce water use by about 50%, but hey, your mechanic might thank you, right? We're not using so much water all over the equipment. Maybe you get a little less rust, a little less wear and tear. And then one thing you can do if you're going to use those tools to reduce water use, how about you measure it too? And this is just attaching another flow meter again, 50, 75 bucks, pick this up somewhere, know how much you use. And then, you know what, let's look at that cart barn too, right? You guys are washing equipment. The standard image in my head, Frank, I worked in a cart barn, is you just got a kid who's just pointing the hose and just on his phone spraying it, right? So, maybe it's a good thing if you're concerned about water use, especially moving into the future where we may start paying a lot more for water, thinking more judiciously about using water. Let's think about how much water we use on the wash pad and think about ways to reduce that.
And I'm telling you, Carl, the other thing that you put in each slide about the cart barn is worth noting, because not only are we obviously trying to conserve water in many places, but we're also there's a greater demand for water. Carts are being washed more frequently now. And I think it's just good knowledge to know, hey, how much did our water use go up during the pandemic? How much of our water use gone up since we've gone to single cart people, right? And can we clean them a different way that's not as reliant on using potable water? And of course, Carl, you're the you're the expert with those cart barn BMPs that one of these days are going to see the light of day.
We'll see one day maybe.
All right. So let's get to the grown grass part. That I tell you that some of these low-hanging fruits in the BMPs. Big thanks to Carl and everybody, Rick Slatter, everybody helps us put these together. And we're going to be out and about talking about these more. But for now, the story is play and traffic, and people want to get out there. And you learned this morning that the average temperatures really at this time of the year for our, the Northeast is between the mid 50s and the mid 60s. And so it's been much warmer than normal over the last several weeks, which has given us this fall sense, and the growing season has really pushed. Now, Doug Soldat tweeted out a really interesting picture last week also about how phosphorus deficiency is showing up where he's putting on more fertilizer, where he's getting more growth. In places where he had low or very little phosphorus, he was seeing no deficiency symptoms. Now, that's just a small aspect of the way plants manage and show nutrient deficiencies. But I think we also see a lot of people worried about bentgrass turning red, POA turning red at this time of the year, or the bentgrass especially. Is it red leaf spot or whatever? And I would say in general, I think we're hearing most of the time, it's just a little bit of phosphorus deficiency or uptake stuff. Look at your growth rates, right? Now, of course, we're all pushing our growth rates these days just to keep up with the traffic. Now, I think when you talk about growth rates and how things are moving along and coming together, you start to focus on the soil temperatures. And you can see now we've changed the scale down here at the bottom, where the majority of us now are in the upper 40s and 50s, right? Obviously, as you get down to where Dr. Askew is, it's quite a bit warmer soil conditions in South Jersey and Delmarva, the Philly area. And then when you get into the New York metropolitan area, you're talking about pretty steady early, low to mid 50s. So things are really accelerating. It's going to be interesting moving forward. A lot of guys taking advantage, maybe trying to do some aerification. The funny thing is we get these greens in perfect shape and then we go do this to them. I keep wondering about this, but we'll hold this for another day. Maybe when we can get my pal Rakaswa on and talk to him about the problems with early spring aerification. Now, the season has definitely advanced very rapidly. You can see a Buffalo and Rochester in particular, down in the metro New York area. Everybody is pretty generally a week to 2 weeks ahead of normal. Now, you can accumulate growing degree days, base 50, pretty rapidly at this time of year. That's why we use base 32 for the seedhead discussion that we're going to have later over the course of over the morning here. So what is coming up? Well, you can look at one way to visualize this pretty much from here to the 21st next week. We're going to be below normal, right? We've got a high percentage of being below normal, particularly for most of the Northeast, maybe up into Maine, where the 5 people who live in Maine up here with Robert Searle are listening. They may get a little bit above normal, but most of us are going to be a little bit cooler. And then when it comes to rainfall, there was a couple of big winners this past week, but most, again, were on the, mid to half to 3/4 of an inch was pretty widespread across the region. And the outlook is looking for a little more rain along the coast. So certainly coastally, you can expect some rain over the next week anyway. Now, the topic for today with my esteemed colleague is annual bluegrass, right? And particularly this aspect of annual bluegrass growth and development that continues to plague us. Now, we have done everything we can over the years to try to target these early spring applications, both with embark and proxy. But I want to go back a little bit, probably even before Dr. Askew might have even been born. You guys, young weed scientists, are so great nowadays that back in the early 80s, there was a scientist, Rich Cooper, who from Ohio, was doing this work with Tony Koski when they were graduate students at the Ohio State University, working for John Street. This is the original work with embark that looked at seedhead suppression, right? Annual bluegrass seedhead suppression. So one of the first things that came out of this particular study was that when you sprayed the medium or high rate of embark, right? Here's no embark, low rate, medium, and high rate. You look at the data of total non-structural carbohydrates, which is a measure of the stored energy that a plant might have available to us, both in soluble sugars and long chain storage compounds like fructose and starch in warm season grasses, right? So then they looked at root elongation. They also found, a long time ago that high rates of embark or even medium rates of embark were really accelerating root elongation compared to control. Certainly the high rate did. Now, the other thing that this paper noted is that the content of carbohydrate content, while it increased when you suppress the seed heads, it then depleted after the fact because this was the early indication of the rebound effect, right? This was our first identification of the rebound effect that, of course, has served as the basis for a lot of growing degree models that are used and why we use them. And then along came Dr. Askew and asked the question, what if we applied these things later in the season? And particularly winter in the mid-Atlantic where Dr. Askew is based, he saw immediately that seed head suppression, when you added that winter application, winter and spring was certainly better than spring by itself. Now, Zach Riker goes to work for Bayer, puts together a national look at this thing, right? I just found this recently, Shawn, that this paper was done. And of course, you were on it with many of our colleagues, John Inguajato here in Connecticut. And here are the application timings for this fall application of Proxy now. Remember the research I showed you was based on mefluidide, but that's been pretty much replaced, both because people had a hard time figuring out how to use it and they stopped making it. So Proxy became the go-to compound that also wasn't as hard necessarily on adjacent plants that might have been treated. Now, here's the crazy data that, again, for those of you watching on News Channel 6 can hone in on this. We'll just take it really simple and go to the Connecticut data, right? So here is untreated, and you can see lots of room under the seed head cover progress curve, right? How much seed heads we were able actually to suppress. So the pretty standard spring applications of Proxy and Primo, for those of you watching, is in red. And then anything that had a fall application is in yellow, gray, or blue. And you can see in general, we continue to see this improvement in seed head suppression. And I would venture to say consistency. I think one of the things I've noticed about these fall applications, Shawn, is they're a lot more consistently giving you suppression. And I think sometimes people overestimate how well things didn't work. We used to get 40% suppression if we got lucky in the spring, 50% if we got lucky, and we beat the band how great that was. So I think the fall applications have definitely, I think, brought some more consistency. So let's talk about this a little bit with three simple questions. Are we seeing better suppression in the fall? What is your thoughts about, I don't expect you to have the research, so I'm kind of asking you to speculate here, about health benefits compared to embark using Proxy? And how much does, we'll get to the point Carl was bringing up before I jumped on, how much does annual bluegrass seed head stuff impact putting? So with that, I'm going to stop sharing and I'm going to look at you, and we'll start with how well are these fall things working everywhere, and in particular, we're here in the Northeast for us.
All right, so thanks for having me on, Frank. And first of all, the concept behind this fall application deal is that it has to do with it's something that we don't really know. It has to do with how is Ethefon inhibiting seed head development. And certainly I would surmise that what Ethefon is doing is different from what mefluidide was doing. All right. And so Ethefon is acting much more like a hormone in that it is affecting the decision of the plant, whether or not it will make a seed head. And unfortunately, there's 4 or 5 other hormones, many of them environmentally induced, that are doing the same thing. So all of these, and this is me kind of speculating on what we think we know in the literature.
It's okay. Don't worry, Shawn. Right. Nobody's listening. Nobody's watching. It's just us.
Anyway, So the idea is that Ethefon is an influencer among several influencers. So as your environment changes from one winter season, spring season to the next, all these influencers are competing. If you get Ethefon out in the spring, who are you influencing? You're only going to influence the plants that have not yet decided to make a seed head. And so the premise is if you put Ethefon out in the fall and in the spring, you maintain a strong level of influence from that ethylene escalation that's happening when you apply Ethefon, so that even if you have a rogue warm day in the winter, you have that fall base application to continue to signal to the plants, don't make a seed head, don't make a seed head, don't make a seed head. Even if there are environmental cues that says, no, make a seed head, man, what are you thinking? It's time.
Right,
The Ethefon is saying, don't make a seed head. These things are competing. And one thing that I've noticed in our research, we always see phenomenal effects of this fall versus spring thing. And we also see phenomenal, we're talking 90+% seed head suppression. I don't see those seed head suppression levels on in-play golf courses.
Do
And
you
honestly,
think that's because of timing, or do you think that's because you might only have one biotype, or do you think it's a little bit of both? The lingering question is, Shawn, what you started with, something we don't know. Have you done, or is the National Annual Bluegrass Project working at all at trying to figure out what are the keys to flower initiation that you may be hitting that many other guys can't hit?
I honestly, so we're not looking at seed head suppression per se in that national program. We're looking more at herbicide resistance. And what I can say, and we're not really looking at PGRs. Paclobutrazol is one of the products, but a lot of the researchers have kind of shied away from it because there's not a baseline, expectation for resistance. And Paclo is a product that utilizes environmental stress as a cohort to try to achieve displacement of annual bluegrass. You don't just spray Paclo and kill annual bluegrass. So how do you test resistance, right? And so it's a lot more complicated than the protocol they first designed for this project. And we're not getting outstanding information about how PGRs are influencing the POA, but at Virginia Tech, we did kind of up the ante on Paclo, and we are seeing a lot of mechanisms, or at least we're seeing several populations that were responding quite differently to Paclo than other populations. And I honestly believe that what's happening with Ethefon and seed head suppression on golf courses is probably more due to the fact that Ethefon has been used repeatedly on many of these golf courses, and therefore we've already found the super sensitive biotypes, and they haven't been able to make seed for a decade, and they're not there. And so, whereas at Tech, I can get 90% control on a given golf course that's used Ethefon for 8 to 10 years or more, they can't. And I think it's due to some level of resistance that's built up. Now, not to say, not in the classical sense, I'm not saying that, oh, well, Ethefon doesn't work or Proxy doesn't work at your course anymore because you got resistance. It's not quite like that. But I do think that the response of the population is a bit muted compared to a population that's never seen.
So what you're suggesting, this is very interesting. What you're suggesting is chronic use that does a good job of suppressing seed heads of a particular type that might be prevalent in a location. Over time, because that seed bank is depleted, because if there's new recruits, so that begs the next question. How come, or does Proxy in your mind lead to a healthier annual bluegrass plant that, like Embark did, and therefore you're getting, but is that reducing fitness in some way?
Well, so the Ethefon, along with other like Primo and the things that we do to culturally manage our greens, do cater to POA survival. Environmental stress fights that. And, we kind of want to lose POA in most cases, but we don't want to lose it rapidly. We want to lose it slowly. And so, but we're managing to maintain a putting surface above all else. And therefore POA just rides along and gets the benefits from that. And yes, when we inhibit seed head production, just like was shown with the carbohydrate changes with mafluidide, we inhibit the plant from spending massive amounts of stored energy to make those seed. And so the ability to preserve that stored energy gives those plants the ability to make all of the environmental fighting things that they need to manage stress later in the season as they start to experience the stress. Now, if you contrast that with not using a seed head suppressor and having copious amounts of seed heads being produced daily, literally daily, we're mowing off new seed production with oils and fatty acids, and we're talking high energy stuff daily. And then what happens? The plant starts to turn yellow as soon as the first hint of warm weather, and they'll start to die out, right? Because they have literally, they've given it everything they've got. And that's what they're designed to do. That's what an annual plant is designed to do. It's designed to give it everything it's got, put all of the energy into that endosperm of those seed, and then die. And then their longevity is based on that seed production. And with POA, I mean, they can get in and fit in anywhere, right? And so that's how they're designed. So we take out that energy production and we leave those existing plants more. But let's get back to the proxy thing and the resistance. So POA is primarily, even though we manage and we've actually produced phenotypes of perennial plants, POA is an annual plant. And even on greens, a large percentage, even of our highly managed, which results in high percentage of perennial POA, highly managed greens, we still have a lot of annual POA. Well, which one of them's produce seed? The ones that Ethefon is not as active on. So there's no way we can't be selecting for phenotypes within that population that are less susceptible to Ethefon, or it might be, there's so many mechanisms that could be at play here. It could be that they're more susceptible to the environmental cues that say make a seed head, so they don't hear the Ethefon.
Okay, so this raises a question to me that you must have asked yourself when you started this thing is, yeah, I know when I studied pre-emergent applications of crabgrass stuff in the fall, the first question I got is, well, what happens if my grass dies in the winter and I need to seed in the spring? How concerned were you, and what do you see of maybe a negative effect of applying a growth regulator at that time of the year, which is odd, right? Most guys are applying it with their snow mold.
Right.
I mean,
right.
most places that's almost recommended. But when you were imagining this, have you seen any downside to that fall app relative to sort of setback of the POA if you've got pure POA surfaces like a lot of guys do here in the Northeast?
Right. My biggest fear was for you folks, like in northern New York and extremely cold climates, any climate where in the winter it's possible to lose POA because of winter stress. That's not my environment. You know, we get severe winters, but the longevity and we don't get ice cover and snow cover for long periods. We don't even, our guys put down snow mold, but not every year. It's only if they really expect. So it's not the same environment, but we were keen to look at any indicator of that in our research, even though I don't have the extreme environment that you guys would have to truly test it. And I haven't seen anything that really suggests that amping up your Ethefon program with winter apps or fall apps. Some people are doing fall and winter apps followed by spring apps. What I often see associated with POA injury from Ethefon is in the spring, if you're getting intermittent frost events and Ethefon is on the ground, we'll see POA, turn yellow, turn orange. But I haven't seen that type of effect during harsh winter conditions. I see the same level of, your reddening and the red tips, things that would be caused by a cold temperature induced phosphorus availability issue. Those things are fairly uniform in the non-treated as well as in the Ethefon treated. We don't really see, I haven't seen an indication that the Ethefon is going to reduce winter survival. But I haven't had the environment to test it.
Okay. One more question on this stuff with plant health things, because we get these lingering early season anthracnose infections, Shawn, where guys might use the fall app on their greens because they've had some success. But as you know, you've talked about, there's a lot of variables involved with this plant. It's not a sort of straightforward deal. It adapts, adjusts. We don't understand how it's doing it. We have a lot of issues with guys who have to push their greens later into the season. It's not really a winter thing. It's more just, man, growth regulations from this. Then they got DMIs that they're putting on for summer patch stuff. Then they might use a pre-crab goose application, right? The oxidized on benzoylide combination. And we've talked about this in the show so far this year. And I'm wondering what your thoughts are about how proxy adds or helps to that sort of early season regulation issue, and if that isn't some of the problems that we see happening when POA starts to fail.
Well, I don't think proxy is going to help. And I've actually designed and conducted studies looking at your 90 GDD early dollar spot program with DMIs, and I've thrown all those things into the system to try to see what comes out the other end. And I haven't really seen anything with the limited work that I'm able to do and in the environment that I have. So no, I haven't seen indications that proxy's heating things up or really stirring the pot in a bad way when it comes to all of these additives. I think it's a matter of managing your environmental stress and just knowing that if you put a growth regulator like Ethefon, or if you put a growth regulating DMI down, you're not helping. So it's a matter of, in your shaded areas, your weak areas, it's just a matter of keeping a keen eye on how they're going to respond to whatever that challenge is, and knowing that you're not helping that problem by adding these. So then it's, you're weighing your need for seed head suppression against a risk over here, and you just have to balance.
But it's interesting. I want to ask you this last question about playability. Carl, kill me if I don't get you on this in a minute, but what you just described is really fascinating, because within a green, you might have a shade or a high traffic area that maybe that's where you shut the boom off, or if you go at a lower rate, right, or whatever. And I think that's the kind of site specific management, again, that we've got to start thinking about. And this is, of course, another example of it. Okay.
That's 100% a mental thing too. I see the one that drives me nuts are athletic field managers. You have a multiplex, and it's 3 or 4 fields together, and there's very measurable and repeatable high wear spots on these fields, but the vast majority of it is like in between area where people set up their lawn chairs and stuff, and that could get a pre-emerge. We could put a root inhibiting pre on 60-70% of that area, as long as you don't put it on the high wear areas. But nobody seems to have that concept in their head of zone treating.
Because we didn't train him this right. We didn't train him with the mindset to go out
uniform application, et cetera, right.
And it wasn't so easy to not do it in the past. And I think you're right. We talk about this all the time at sports fields. Okay, so now, I know you've done the work with bent and POA spots that shows the deflection, and those interested could go listen to our wonderful podcast episode. That's one of the most listened to ones we've ever done. I'm interested in the other side of this. Where we get a lot of POA, and you get some POA seeds and some POA doesn't seed, would you expect the same kind of trouble in putting, in that situation? Because I'm perplexed by why they complain about POA in the Pacific Northwest and Southern California, where torrey pines and bumpy POA is all you hear out there. And then they come to Wingfoot and they think it's bentgrass and it's 100% POA annua. How do you reconcile the impact of the way we think about POA's effect on putting performance?
So in our ball roll work, very few of the POA patches had seed heads. And if they did have seed heads, it was at a time of year where it was a bit later in the season. The seed heads were mostly diminished. So we would have a clump that in prime seed head production would have had, say, 250 seed heads on it. When we did our work, there may have been 5. So seed heads weren't a major contributor when we did our work, and it was on both of the golf courses where we selected multiple greens were pretty high end. The management, the way we like to describe it, if you close your eyes, we can leave you there all day. You will not find that POA plant. You're not going to be able to feel it. But when you open your eyes, you can see that there is a textural difference. I just don't know that the human hand could have picked it up. So outside of seed heads, just talking about POA, what's the deal with ball roll? I would say I can sum it up as simply as this. The higher the difference between bent and POA composition gets, the worse your ball roll is going to be. So as you move to a predominantly POA system, your ball roll is your consistency of roll is going to improve. As you move to a predominantly bent system, your consistency is going to improve. But where you're rolling across POA and you encounter a zone of bent, I would expect a deviation there. Either the bent density is going to be low enough that the ball is going to sink in more, and when it comes back out on the other side like a wave, it's going to hit that POA. And I'm increasing the magnitude of the actual effects. We're talking microscopic effects, but it's enough once that slight bounce has been created. And when the ball starts to bounce, when it comes back into the canopy, it plows into the canopy. And now density changes in the canopy can steer it a little bit left or a little bit right. And so when you transition from POA to bent to POA to bent, that's where you have problems. If you're all POA, you're good. If you're all bent, you're good.
Shawn, what a joy. Carl, we're at 30 minutes, but I don't want to leave without letting you bring up the stat of, putting later in the day, the leaders. Can you ask Shawn about that particular stat?
Well, so, we have the shot link data now, Shawn, and there's these people on Twitter who analyze all this data and look at when players play during the day, what is their strokes gain, what is their putting performance like, basically. And once you normalize for a player's ability and look at AM, PM, they see, although it's only a microscopic little bit, they putt worse in the afternoons than in the mornings. I don't think that's revolutionary to us. If you could speculate quickly on what you think might cause that, is it the growth changes? Is it the traffic influence of all the
any
rounds? What would
anomaly
you
on
think
the green? Any anomaly on the green is going to be magnified with growth. So if it's a differential between POA and bent, that differential is going to be greater the further away from mowing you get. If it's a ball mark, the differential between the perimeter of the ball mark and the ball mark itself is going to be the greatest the further away from the mowing you get. And so I think even if it's let's say it's a Pythium root issue that's causing a regulation of a pure bent green, and POA has nothing to do with it, then the fact that part of that green is not growing as effectively and the other is, you're going to have the highest degree of difference between density and that could steer the ball the further away from mowing that you get. So their data, I think, is biologically real, and the only way we'd be able to see it is by taking that massive amounts of data and showing how, look at here, there's this slight change in their performance later in the day. Yes, I think it's magnifying these differences that truly are on the green, but they are of such subtle influence. It took me and my student 1.5 years, 2 years, tens of thousands of balls just to control variability enough to start to measure.
Yeah. And for those interested, there's great papers on this, right, Carl? We've done deep dives on this a few times. We're at the witching hour. Shawn, let me thank you for joining us.
Glad to be
really
here.
Appreciate you taking the time, particularly on short notice. Carl, we could talk to this guy all day, but we better let everybody get back to work.
Yeah, we'll get everybody back. Thanks everybody for joining. I did post the podcast that Frank and Shawn did a year ago, talking a little bit more in depth about some of this stuff. They also talk about a POA cure, a product that may help you if you're in that kind of 50 bent, 50 POA range, getting further to one side or the other. Maybe that's an interesting conversation for you to check out. So thanks everybody for joining. Tomorrow's webinar, we'll have Matt Elmore on from Rutgers University talking about some early weed seed issues. And until then, we'll see you guys later.
See you guys later. Thanks, Shawn.
Guys. Yep.
This has been a production of Cornell University, on the web at cornell.edu.